This Tuesday sees a high-level plenary meeting to commemorate and promote the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons as part of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Women's rights activists across Latin America are mobilising to demand their governments remove barriers to abortion on the occasion of the Global Day of Action for access to safe and legal abortion. Cuba leads the list of Latin American countries with the highest percentage of its population vaccinated against COVID-19. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. This Tuesday saw a high-level plenary meeting to commemorate and promote the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations. The high-level meeting aims to raise awareness about the threat posed to humanity by nuclear weapons and the necessity for their elimination in order to mobilise international efforts towards achieving the common goal of a nuclear weapon-free world. The International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, observed annually on September 26, provides an occasion for the global community to reaffirm its commitment to global nuclear disarmament as a priority. Achieving the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons remains one of humanity's greatest challenges and has always been one of the key objectives of the United Nations. Speaking at the high-level plenary meeting to commemorate and promote the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, the Foreign Secretary of Mexico, Marcelo Ebrard, urged all UN member states to honour the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
We welcome the fact that the first conference of the parties to the TPNW will be held in March 2022 in Vienna. Once again, we urge states that have not yet done so to accede to this treaty, and we call upon all members of the United Nations to welcome this development, a development which contributes to a safer and more peaceful world.
Also addressing the high-level plenary meeting, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez highlighted that the elimination of nuclear weapons should be a priority for all nations.
Cuba, together with the non-aligned movement, has firmly and systematically demanded the prohibition and total elimination of nuclear weapons. This is and should remain the highest priority in the field of disarmament.
Addressing the meeting, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Felix Plasencia stressed that the total elimination of nuclear weapons is the only guarantee against their potential use.
The complete elimination of nuclear weapons is the only guarantee against their potential use. With this in mind, the implementation of the voluntary commitments and legally binding obligations in the field of nuclear disarmament, including of the provisions of Article 6 of the NPT, constitutes a historic debt to be paid with increasing urgency by nuclear weapons states.
Addressing the high-level plenary meeting honouring the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, Peruvian Foreign Minister Oscar Montoya de Romaña stressed that the use or threat of the use of nuclear weapons constitute a crime against humanity.
Annual commemoration of this day provides us with an opportunity to speak with one voice and call for global nuclear disarmament. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapons constitutes a crime against humanity and a grave violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter, as has been indicated by the International Court of Justice.
Also addressing the high-level meeting, the Minister of International Relations of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, reiterated that the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is a result of an effort by the international community to prevent a disaster.
The treaty is the result of an increased focus by the international community on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any nuclear weapon explosion, as envisaged in the first resolution adopted by the General Assembly 75 years ago. The treaty complements the objectives of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which remains the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation.
The World Health Organization on Tuesday released the final independent commission's report into allegations of sexual abuse by aid workers during the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo between 2018 and 2020. More than 80 alleged cases of sexual abuse were found, including allegations implicating 20 WHO staff members. The head of the UN agency apologized to the victims and vowed to punish those responsible.
The first thing I want to say is to the victims and survivors of the sexual exploitation and abuse described in the Commission's report. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what was done to you by people who were employed by WHO to serve and protect you. I'm sorry for the ongoing suffering that these events must cause. I'm sorry that you have had to relieve them in talking to the Commission about your experiences. Thank you for your courage in doing so. What happened to you should never happen to anyone. It is inexcusable. It's my top priority to ensure that the perpetrators are not excused but are held to account.
China on Tuesday showed off its increasingly sophisticated air power, including surveillance drones, as part of the country's biggest air show. The six-day event in the southern coastal city of Zhuhai comes as Beijing pushes to meet a 2035 deadline to retool its military for modern warfare. It showcases China's homegrown aviation and space technologies, with thousands of guests, visitors and journalists attending the air show on the first day under strict epidemic prevention measures. Audiences and enthusiasts worldwide came across surprises, with key information and strategic plans related to China's most advanced aerial weapons and equipment, including the latest developments on the J-20 stealth fighter jet, the long-rumored H-20 strategic stealth bomber, and a series of cutting-edge drones announced for the first time. And we'll be right back after this very short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Women's rights activists across Latin America are mobilising to demand their governments remove barriers to legal abortion. In the framework of the Global Day of Action for Access to Safe and Legal Abortion, feminist organisations in Argentina, which recently legalised the right to abortion, insist that there remain outstanding obstacles to its implementation in legal, social and hospital terms. Meanwhile, Ecuadorian activists marched on Tuesday in favour of decriminalising abortion, despite conservative groups threatening to silence the protest in the capital, Quito. Meanwhile, Chilean pro-abortion activists are celebrating the fact that the lower house will analyse the decriminalisation of abortion up to 14 weeks of pregnancy. In this context, Mexican activists are calling on the authorities to move forward in accordance with the Supreme Court's resolution so that lawmakers legislate in favour of the right to abortion throughout the country. At the same time, in the United States, dozens of pro-abortion demonstrators gathered in Maryland to protest the decision by 5 Supreme Court judges not to stop the strict ban on abortion in the state of Texas, which went into effect on September 1st and prohibits abortions from 6 weeks of pregnancy. Women also took to the streets of El Salvador on Tuesday to call for abortion rights as they presented a proposal to Congress to legalise it in some cases. Abortion is completely prohibited and harshly punished in the country, and President Nayib Bukele is firmly against abortion rights. The leader of the Citizens Association for the Decriminalisation of Therapeutic, Ethical and Eugenic Abortion, Morena Herrera, explained that the proposal is a request for a reform of the penal code to decriminalise abortion on 3 grounds: when a life of the pregnant woman is at risk, when a fetal malformation has been detected that is incompatible with extrauterine life, and when the pregnancy is the result of sexual violence. President Bukele withdrew a constitutional reform proposal in mid-September, drafted by his own government, which opened the door to legalise therapeutic abortion. Salvadoran legislation bans abortion in all cases, with penalties of up to 8 years in prison. Prosecutors and judges classify some cases of abortion, even involuntary ones, as aggravated homicide, punishable by up to 50 years in prison. General elections scheduled for November in Haiti have been postponed indefinitely after the country's interim Prime Minister dismissed all members of the body which organises elections. Prime Minister Ariel Henry, who was appointed by late President Jovenel Moïse 2 days before being assassinated, published a decree announcing the dissolution of the 9-member Provisional Electoral Council. The PM also said that the process to replace the council had begun and elections would take place after constitutional review in the first months of the coming year. Before this postponement, the Electoral Council had set the first round of voting in presidential and legislative elections, as well as for a constitutional referendum, for November 7th. The second round was scheduled for January 2022, along with municipal and local elections. Asylum seekers in the northern coastal city of Iquique in Chile have suffered attacks by local residents protesting against their presence. Camps have been set up in town squares and even on beaches as people in a desperate situation seek to be able to build a new life in Chile. Over the weekend, thousands of locals marched in Iquique, voicing xenophobic anti-immigrant slogans and even setting fire to the belongings of asylum seekers after a camp was cleared by the police on Friday. Despite the restrictions linked to the pandemic, people from Venezuela and elsewhere continue to try to reach other nations seeking a better life, including Chile. The Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families opened its 33rd session this Tuesday. Chief of the Human Rights Treaties Branch at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ibrahim Salama, commended the committee for the development and adoption of a general comment on migrants' rights to liberty and freedom from arbitrary detention. He further noted that the COVID-19 pandemic had drastically affected all forms of human mobility, leaving hundreds of thousands of migrants stranded and unable to return to their home countries. During the pandemic, migrant workers have been at high risk of infection with COVID-19 due to overcrowding and lack of access to basic services in immigration detention. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Cuba leads the list of Latin American countries with the highest percentage of its population vaccinated against COVID-19, a feat even more impressive given that the Caribbean nation is the only one in the region to have developed its own vaccines. According to figures from the country's Ministry of Public Health, more than 9 million people have received at least one dose of the Soberano 2, Soberano Plus or Abdala vaccines out of a population of just over 11 million. To date, over 6 million people have received 2 doses of a vaccine and almost 5 million are fully vaccinated. Cuba is also one of the first nations to carry out a vaccination campaign for children between the ages of 2 and 18, in which more than 1.8 million doses have already been administered. Paraguayan health workers began a 2-week national strike to demand better pay and conditions, stressing that negotiations have not led to any solutions to their demands. Members of the National Medical Doctors Union of Paraguay launched a nationwide strike on Tuesday to demand that all doctors in the country be covered by a new regulation limiting shift lengths to 12 hours a day. Doctors are also demanding pay equity, noting that professionals in other sectors are paid on the basis of their speciality, training and hours worked. The General Secretary of the Doctors Union, Rosana Gonzalez, announced that Tuesday would see a march and rallies outside the Ministry of Public Health and the Ministry of Labour and called on authorities to respond to the sector's demands. Russia has reported its highest daily COVID-19 death toll yet, following an increase in cases linked to the Delta variant. A government tally reported 852 fatalities over the past 24 hours, a record in Russia since the start of the pandemic. The new figure brings the country's total coronavirus death toll to over 205,000. Moscow, the epicenter of the outbreak, has experienced a spike over the past week, with authorities warning of rising hospital admissions. Authorities face the challenge of a vaccine-skeptic population, with polls showing that a majority of Russians do not plan to get jabbed. Brazil has been one of the countries most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in the world. The National Congress has been investigating the way in which the Jair Bolsonaro administration has dealt with the health crisis, and information has come to light that could implicate the president himself and several of his ministers in shady dealings in relation to the handling of the pandemic. More in the following report by our correspondent Brian Meir.
Brazil's Congress has been investigating the disastrous mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic by the Jair Bolsonaro administration for several months now, but new allegations have come out this week that are threatening some of the top officials in the government, including Economics Minister Paulo Guedes, the Health Ministry, and President Bolsonaro himself. These allegations are connected to a large healthcare provider in the private sector called Prevent Senior. During the first wave of the pandemic, when the Bolsonaro administration was trying to block vaccines from coming into the country, and following Donald Trump's lead, promoting medicines for early treatment that had no proven effect against the virus, Prevent Senior commissioned a large study, which, unlike most of the other studies in the world, showed some level of effectiveness in treatment with hydroxychloroquine, including an allegation that it reduced the time that patients spent on ventilators by 50%. It's now come out that they fabricated the result of this study. They cooked the numbers and they hid death records of patients who had died from the treatment. This week, lawyer Bruno Morato testified to the Congressional Commission that 2 weeks before she came in to testify, her office was broken into, thieves stole all of her hard drives and her computers, but that she'd made a backup of all the information. As a result of the material evidence and the testimonies taking place this week in Brazil's Congress, the São Paulo Public Prosecutor's Office has requested access to the data so that it can start homicide charges against Prevent Senior, which was one of the largest supporters of the Bolsonaro government.
Thank you, Brian. Moving on to other news, Colombia's National Strike Committee called for fresh, peaceful mobilisations on Tuesday to reject the neoliberal economic policies of the Ivan Duque government. Social movements, trade unions and indigenous organisations are demanding that Congress make progress with 10 bills which were presented on July 27th by the National Strike Committee, expressing the popular demands voiced after more than a year of social unrest. The president of the Central Union of Workers, Francisco Maltes, stressed that the struggle against the latest new neoliberal package of measures imposed by the Ivan Duque administration continues. At the same time, National Strike Committee representatives denounced the ongoing and escalating violence in the country, with forced disappearances, assassinations of community leaders, trade unionists and human rights defenders, massacres, repression by security forces and other crimes that violate the human rights of the Colombian population. And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss and thank you for watching.